but this lab we're talking about histology and connective tissues. And like, so what histology means is histo means we're talking about tissue. And tissue is a group of cells that are working together, right? It's like this fundamental multicellular platform, okay? And you can use different tissues, as we know, to like, make different types of organs or, like singular structures, right? Like muscles. So anyway, connective tissue, any kinds of tissue that connect parts of the body. And so they can be anything like the duct tape of the body, like ligaments and tendons that just kind of like tape everything together, like your bones to your bones, your muscles to the bones, various other things. Or they can be on a completely different other side of that framework, which is like blood, connects the body through fluid exchange. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of this one. So we're going to spend some time, I'll tell you about some of the basic histology and then like kind of go over some of what we're going to do in the lab notebook. Like you're going to make this thing called a dichotomous key, so we'll get to that. Then we're going to let you play with some scopes and some slides. Your cell phone camera takes great photos of slides if you want to keep those, okay? And you can also use those in homeworks. There's a way we handle the scopes and put them all away and clean the benches and all of that. And I think you probably remember that from your biology lab days. But if you need some help, I can help you kind of get that refresher. But it needs to be done right every time. And then I will actually check your microscope back in. Make sure all the settings are where they need to be and that it's clean the right way. Okay, no big deal. Okay, cell stuff. Number one, blast cells. Blast cells are baby cells. These are cells that are like newly dividing. It means they're like mitotically active. These are the dividing cells, okay? We're going to look at them in a couple of different forms, but what I want you to think of is these are the baby cells. These are replacers. These are tissue fixers. Your tissue is growing. This is them. And then we stick a prefix on them to tell you where they are and what they're doing for the most part, right? So like fibroblasts have a lot of fibers in them typically, right? Things that connect things, so we find those in connective tissue. Chondro, that's a prefix for cartilage, right? Like chondroichthyes is a shark. It's a cartilaginous shark. So chondrocytes, chondroblasts specifically, those are cartilaginous cells that are starting to replace or make new ones, right? So they're mitotically active in cartilage. Os means bone. Osteoblasts, that's just how we phrase, these are bone cells that are making new parts of bone, okay? Hematopoietic, so hema refers to the heme group inside of like red blood cells, right? That carries oxygen to and fro and like sort of also to a lesser awesomeness, carbon dioxide and other things. These are in bone marrow and those are going to be doing things like producing new parts of blood. The white blood cell, red blood cell, but new parts of the blood, more cells of the blood. When we see the suffix cyte, C-Y-T-E, that's like just like this is a grown cell, all grown up, no mitosis, no mitotic, it's typically not a mitotically active cell, a healthy cell. It's ready to do its job. It maintains what we call the tissue or the cellular matrix, and it lives there too. So the cellular matrix is like just kind of the environment, like the ecosystem that cell lives in. It typically has some like extracellular like fluid that we get from the blood plasma typically. There's some different things that we'll look at. Sometimes it's just a lot of fiber in there. So it can be a few different things. So we'll look at the different matrices that we can do. Chondrocytes, right, you find them in cartilage. Osteocytes, you find those in bones, right? So that's where we look at those. So we're going to talk about, so we start with the epithelia. So an epithelial tissue is a tissue that's like a lining. It's a cover, okay, and it's doing a few different things. So think of an epithelial tissue as being like, let's start on the outside of your skin. Covered with epithelial, and it's doing something. It's keeping in your water, it's keeping out bacteria, it's resisting abrasion, right? So that's some of the things that epithelial does in that particular kind. But then there's other types of epithelia. There's epithelia in your lungs that's helping with that gas exchange, right? It's moisture. It's not super good at resisting abrasion. You know, it's like one tiny cell thick. So that's a very different type of epithelial. But then others still will do things like secrete out mucus, right? So they're actually pushing stuff out into the environment, right? Other cells absorb stuff back, but it's the transition between a tissue type or an organ and the environment, whether it's an internal environment inside of the body or an external environment like outside with the skin. So there's 3 different classifications you gotta know. Let's start with the easy one. There is the fried egg-shaped squamous cell. It's flat, the nucleus is in the middle, and it looks like an over-easy egg. There's cuboidal, which here they made it very cubey, but like really when I think of a cuboidal cell, I think of a cell that's like a marshmallow. And like in the middle of the marshmallow, there's a nucleus, because they all kind of tend to like sit together in a line for the most part. They love to make tubules, right? They're like little cuboidal cells. They do things like manufacture things that are going to get secreted. Secreted is when a cell makes something and pushes it out into the environment. It can be anything from like, you know, neurotransmitters to digestive enzymes, stuff like that. So like an advanced form is what we refer to as the columnar cell. It's tall, and I'll show you some pictures later. But it's like, think of it as a very tall cell. Sometimes it has little hairs on the outside, right? And what it does, typically these are the mucus ones. They're the mucus makers, and so they have like this, like lots of internal like space, square micro footage. I don't want to say square footage, but you know, this is cell. You know, so it's going to be producing things. Typically, we're seeing these in the form of a goblet cell, oftentimes. They're sweeping the linings. These are internal type cells. These ones, squamous external. We also, you know, it's a good abrasion one. And the reason that we like, let's go back to the classification. There's another way we classify them. So like we have the shape and we have the like basics of what they're doing. But then we have like how thick is the layer, because that actually also matters. So there's a couple different ways we do it. Here is simple and stratified. And there's also another one called pseudostratified, which we'll talk about in a bit. But I just want to get through this. So a simple layer means it's just one cell layer thick. Like they're all holding hands. No one's below. No one's above. They're a simple layer. Easy transitions. Right? This is really good for like oxygen exchange in the lungs, for example. But it's like super bad on the outside of your skin. If it was just like one little layer of cells and then dermis, you'd be getting cut all the time. You'd be losing lots of water. And so like there are other forms too. We call these the stratified forms. Stratified layered cells, it's like layer upon layer. And in some parts of your skin, it's like, you know, anywhere from 10 to 20 plus, even 30, like squamous cells thick. Okay? Are they all alive? No. We'll get to that when we talk about integumentary, but yeah. So then there's these thick surfaces, which are really meant to be strong barriers. They're big time strong barriers. Stratified tend to have an order to them. They look orderly. Like if you look at a cinder block wall, it's very orderly. A pseudo-stratified layer, you can see, and we'll look at those a little bit later on, they look like parts of the bricks are sideways and moving up. The cells kind of are going in and out. They are not a regular uniform shape. Okay. So there's this. So epithelial tissues, we were looking at a few different things. We just talked about the idea of the squamous cell, which is the fried egg. The cuboidal cell, which is like kind of the marshmallow with the nucleus in the middle. It makes things like enzymes and secretes like neurotransmitters, all that. And then a columnar, which is long, and that's typically like mucus town, right? Okay, so here's kind of where we see them. So in squamous, we'll have simple squamous, think lungs, alveoli, think stratified squamous, dermis and skin, okay? Simple cuboidal and stratified cuboidal. I want you to take a look at this one. So a simple cuboidal, we see this a lot like in the inside of the kidneys, like, you know, like nephron, like tube type stuff. stratified cuboidal, I want you to look at how orderly it looks. It's like, this is a tissue with a plan. It is, yes, right? It's very stratified. It's very organized. And so when we talk about columnar, this is when we come to a different type of stratification that I want to be specific about. So columnar cells tend to squish next to each other. And there's two kinds of columnar cells you'll find. The first is typically the simple columnar. And they're all, you know, they have an apical surface, which is usually the surface that's touching the outside of wherever, like maybe the outside of, you know, part of the digestive tract, right? And then like going down, the bottom side is the basal layer. So this is the base layer, That's keeping it in place, connective tissue-wise. But then you get this one here. This is the pseudostratified columnar cell tissue. Me? I think it is. Oh, yes. That was us to remember to take our photos of the models, which we did, so good for us, yay. But anyway, so good job, guys. All right, so we're going back to pseudostratified columnar cells. So the pseudostratified columnar cells, I want to make sure that's really off. You can see they're kind of swimming between their layers, right? And so what this is doing is it's pushing specific apical surfaces of cells to the top, usually delivering their payload in this, like mucus is our example right now, for example. And then these cells right here, they're further back towards the basal layer. Maybe they're developing. Maybe they're still working up their, like, you know, goblet droplets, okay? But see how they're not super orderly? That's the difference. Still stratified. There's some on the bottom, some on the top, but like they're kind of not stratified well. This last one over here, this is transitional. So transitional is referring to the fact that you might have a couple different epithelial tissue types, and actually other general tissue types, that are going to be mixed in together. It's transitioning. The dermis, the skin, the epidermis, we'll look at that very, very soon. That's going to be very good for talking about transitional. Does anybody have a question at this point? As long as you're getting the ballpark, we're good. Okay, so that's good. Okay, here's some places you find it. Here's a simple squamous epithelial, right? So air sac, alveolar, lungs, right? Easy transition for gases. Here is a cuboidal epithelial cell. So remember, they love to be in tubules. So here's a tube right here, and this is a sweat duct, okay? So over here, columnar epithelial. So we talked about some of the little hairs, the cilia right here. And we talked about mucus being secreted out, that big payload. There's a columnar right there. And then, let me see if I can get this done. Maybe. No. Yes. Yes. Stratified squamous epithelial cells. It's high abrasion. High abrasion areas. So dermis, stuff like that. Okay. So we're going to move on to